The box arrived at my house on a Monday in early September, shipped from an estate sale company in Hickory, North Carolina, with a note explaining that the items inside had been found in a storage unit that had belonged to my Uncle Martin before his death in 2021. I'd been contacted by the estate liquidator because my name and address had been listed on paperwork inside the unit as next of kin, and they wanted to know if I wanted to claim any personal effects before they sold everything to clear the space and settle outstanding debts. Inside the box were things I expected to find after someone's death: old watches and cufflinks, a high school class ring, a collection of military medals from my uncle's service in the Gulf War. But there were also photograph albums I'd never seen before, filled with images of my uncle with a boy who appeared in pictures spanning from infancy through teenage years. The boy had my uncle's distinctive cleft chin and his dark curly hair, the same wide-set eyes that ran through our family and that marked him unmistakably as a blood relative, and the photographs showed them together at birthday parties and baseball games and camping trips, documenting a relationship that had clearly been central to my uncle's life, even though none of us had known this child existed. The photographs were dated on the backs, spanning from 1994, when the boy appeared as an infant, through 2010, when he looked to be about 16, and my uncle appeared in most of the images looking proud and engaged in ways I rarely remembered seeing him during family gatherings, where he'd always seemed slightly uncomfortable and eager to leave. There were birthday cards signed "Love Dad" tucked between pages of the photo albums, report cards showing strong academic performance with my uncle's signature on the parent acknowledgement lines, and drawings clearly made by a young child with messages like "To Daddy" and "I love you, Dad" written in crayon and marker. The child's name appeared on some of the documents, Jason Crawford, and there were medical records and school enrollment forms listing Martin Crawford as the father, a surname that wasn't my uncle's legal name, but that appeared consistently across all the paperwork, as if my uncle had been living under an assumed identity for at least part of the time he'd been raising this child. I sat on my living room floor, surrounded by evidence of a secret life my uncle had maintained for 16 years at minimum, a son he'd raised and loved and never once mentioned to his family, and I couldn't understand how someone could keep that kind of secret, or why they would choose to hide something that should have been a source of joy and pride. Hickory sits in the foothills of North Carolina, where the Piedmont begins its rise toward the Appalachian Mountains, a city that grew around furniture manufacturing and textile production, and that has struggled economically since those industries collapsed in the late 20th century, when factories moved overseas and the jobs that had sustained the region for generations disappeared. The downtown still shows traces of its industrial past: brick buildings that once housed furniture showrooms, now converted into apartments and restaurants, neighborhoods of modest houses built for factory workers in the 1940s and 1950s, now home to service industry employees and retirees living on fixed incomes. By the time I drove down from Virginia to investigate the storage unit and the life my uncle had apparently lived in Hickory, much of the city had the slightly abandoned feel of places that had lost their economic purpose and were still searching for new identities to replace what had been lost. My uncle had lived in Hickory from the early 1990s until around 2010, according to addresses on the documents in the box, working as a quality control inspector at furniture factories that were gradually closing or downsizing, and he'd apparently maintained this secret family life while also staying connected enough to our family in Virginia that he'd attended holidays and family events, and had never given any indication that he had a child or that his life in North Carolina was anything other than what he claimed. If you want to discover how my uncle maintained a secret son for 16 years while hiding that entire relationship from everyone in our family, subscribe now, because what I found in Hickory will reveal the reasons people keep their children secret and the devastating consequences when those hidden lives are finally exposed after death makes explanation impossible. The storage unit was in a facility on the east side of Hickory, a sprawling complex of climate-controlled units that the manager said had been rented by my uncle since 2010, paid for through automatic bank withdrawals that had continued until 3 months after his death, when the account had finally been closed and the payments had stopped. The manager let me into the unit, a 10 by 15 space filled with furniture and boxes that contained what looked like the complete contents of a household, as if my uncle had moved out of a residence and had put everything in storage intending to retrieve it later, but had never gotten around to unpacking or establishing a new permanent home. There were dishes and kitchen equipment, a bedroom set with a mattress still wrapped in plastic, boxes of clothes in adult and teenage sizes, and more photograph albums documenting the same boy I'd seen in the pictures that had been shipped to me, Jason Crawford, growing from infant to teenager, across hundreds of images that showed birthday parties and school events and ordinary family moments that my uncle had apparently treasured enough to preserve carefully in albums rather than leaving as loose prints scattered in drawers. I spent 4 hours going through that storage unit, examining every box and reading every document I could find, trying to piece together the story of my uncle's secret life and the son he'd raised without ever telling his family. I found a lease agreement for an apartment on 16th Avenue NW, showing that Martin Crawford had rented a 2-bedroom unit from 1994 through 2010, and I found utility bills and bank statements all using the Crawford surname instead of my uncle's legal name of Martin Hayes. There were tax returns filed under the Crawford name claiming head of household status and dependent deductions for Jason Crawford, and there were insurance policies and vehicle registrations all using the false identity my uncle had apparently constructed to support his life in Hickory. The documents showed that my uncle had been living as Martin Crawford continuously for at least 16 years, that he'd built an entire parallel existence, with legal documents and financial accounts and employment records all supporting the false name, and I couldn't understand how someone could maintain that level of deception without eventually being caught by systems that should have flagged the discrepancy between his legal identity and the name he was using in daily life. The estate liquidator who'd contacted me originally had said there was a woman listed in some of the documents from the storage unit, someone named Rebecca Dawson, who appeared to be the mother of Jason Crawford, based on birth certificates and custody agreements I found in a filing cabinet pushed against the back wall of the unit. The birth certificate listed Jason Crawford as born in Hickory in November 1993, mother Rebecca Lynn Dawson, father Martin James Crawford, and there was a notarized custody agreement from 1994 giving Martin primary custody of the child, with Rebecca having visitation rights every other weekend and alternating holidays. I searched for Rebecca Dawson in current databases and found her still living in Hickory, working as a dental hygienist at a practice on Highway 70, and I called her office and left a message saying I was Martin Hayes' niece and that I'd found documents related to Jason Crawford and wanted to talk with her about my uncle and the child they'd apparently raised together. Rebecca called me back that evening, and the first thing she said was that she'd been wondering when someone from Martin's family would finally discover the truth, that she'd expected someone to show up asking questions years ago, but that Martin had been so careful about keeping his two lives separate that apparently no one had suspected anything until after his death. She said Martin had told her from the beginning that he couldn't tell his family about Jason, that there were complicated reasons involving his past and his relationship with his parents that made it impossible for him to acknowledge the child publicly, and she'd accepted that explanation because she'd been young and overwhelmed by unexpected pregnancy, and had been grateful that Martin was willing to be involved at all rather than abandoning her to raise the baby alone. Rebecca said Martin had been a good father to Jason, had been present and supportive, and had taken his responsibilities seriously, even while maintaining the fiction that he was someone named Martin Crawford rather than Martin Hayes, and she'd never fully understood why he'd needed the false identity, but had gone along with it because it had seemed like a small price to pay for having a reliable co-parent who contributed financially and emotionally to raising their son. I asked Rebecca if she would meet with me to talk about Martin and Jason and to help me understand the 16 years my uncle had spent living a secret life in Hickory, and she agreed to meet at a coffee shop near her workplace the following Saturday. When we sat down, she showed me more photographs of Jason, images that extended beyond what I'd found in the storage unit, pictures of him as a young adult that showed he'd grown into a man who looked strikingly like my uncle and like my own father, who was Martin's older brother. Rebecca said Jason was now 30 years old, living in Asheville working as a graphic designer, and that he knew his father had died in 2021, but hadn't attended the funeral because Martin had told him years ago that his extended family didn't know about Jason's existence, and that showing up would create complications and questions that Martin didn't want to deal with. Rebecca said Jason had been hurt by that exclusion, had felt like a shameful secret that his father was embarrassed to acknowledge, and that relationship had been strained during Martin's final years, when Jason had pushed for more honesty, and Martin had continued insisting that the separation between his two lives needed to be maintained. Rebecca told me that Martin had met her in 1993 when she was working as a waitress at a restaurant where he'd been a regular customer, that they'd dated briefly and she'd gotten pregnant unintentionally, and that Martin had initially seemed panicked and had talked about not being ready for fatherhood before eventually deciding that he wanted to be involved in raising the child. She said Martin had explained that he'd had a difficult relationship with his own father, that there had been conflict and estrangement that he didn't want to discuss in detail, and that reconnecting with his family to tell them about the baby would require addressing old wounds and old conflicts that he wasn't emotionally prepared to handle. Rebecca had been skeptical of that explanation, had sensed there was more to the story than Martin was willing to share, but she'd been focused on preparing for the baby and hadn't pushed for details that Martin clearly didn't want to provide. She said Martin had suggested using his mother's maiden name Crawford for official documents related to the baby, had said it would make things simpler and would avoid questions from his family if they somehow discovered the birth records, and she'd agreed because it had seemed like a reasonable compromise that would allow Martin to be involved without forcing him to confront whatever family issues were preventing him from being open about Jason's existence. I asked Rebecca if Martin had ever explained why he couldn't tell his family about Jason, if there had been specific incidents or conflicts that had created the secrecy, and she said Martin had been vague, but had implied that his father had strong opinions about responsibility and family obligations, and would have been judgmental about an unplanned pregnancy with someone Martin wasn't married to. Rebecca said she'd urged Martin over the years to reconnect with his family and introduce them to Jason, had argued that whatever conflicts existed in the past shouldn't prevent Jason from knowing his grandparents and extended family, but Martin had always deflected those conversations and had insisted that the timing wasn't right, or that reopening those relationships would create more problems than it would solve. She said she'd eventually stopped pushing, had accepted that Martin's relationship with Jason would exist separately from his relationship with his family in Virginia, and had focused on making sure Jason had a stable childhood with two parents who loved him, even if they weren't together romantically, and even if one parent was keeping him secret from an entire branch of the family tree. Rebecca showed me text messages between Martin and Jason from the years before Martin's death, conversations that revealed tension and hurt around the secrecy and around Jason's desire to meet his extended family. In one exchange from 2019, Jason had written that he was tired of being a secret, that he wanted to know his grandparents before they died and wanted his father's family to know he existed, and Martin had responded that the situation was complicated in ways Jason didn't understand, and that forcing the issue would damage relationships that Martin had worked hard to maintain. Jason had written back asking whose relationships Martin was protecting, pointing out that he'd prioritized his family in Virginia over his son's emotional needs for Jason's entire life, and Martin had ended the conversation by saying he'd made his choices and that Jason would have to accept them or decide to build a life that didn't depend on Martin's approval or participation. Rebecca said that exchange had been typical of their dynamic in Jason's adult years, that Martin had become defensive whenever challenged about the secrecy, and had refused to consider that his choices might have been harmful to Jason, regardless of whatever reasons had motivated them originally. I called my father after meeting with Rebecca, told him what I'd found in the storage unit and about the nephew he'd never known existed, and there was a long silence on the phone before he asked if I was certain about the information and whether there was any possibility I'd misunderstood the situation. I said I'd seen birth certificates and custody agreements and 16 years of photographs documenting Martin's relationship with Jason, that there was no doubt my uncle had raised a son in Hickory while maintaining his connections to our family and never once mentioning that he had a child. My father said Martin had always been private and had kept his personal life separate from family gatherings, but that he'd never imagined his brother was keeping something as significant as a child secret, that the level of deception required to maintain that separation seemed incompatible with the brother he thought he knew. I asked my father if he knew of any conflicts or issues that might have motivated Martin to keep Jason's secret, any family dynamics that would have made my uncle feel he couldn't be honest about an unplanned pregnancy, and my father said their parents had been conservative and religious and had strong opinions about proper behavior and family structure, but that he didn't think those opinions alone would have been enough to drive Martin to hide a child for 3 decades. My father said he wanted to meet Jason, wanted to acknowledge his nephew and try to build some kind of relationship even though Martin was no longer alive to explain his choices or facilitate introductions, and I gave him Jason's contact information that Rebecca had provided with Jason's permission. My father called Jason that evening, and they talked for 2 hours according to what my father told me later, covering Jason's childhood and his memories of Martin and his feelings about having been kept secret from half his family for his entire life. Jason told my father that Martin had been a good dad in most respects, had been present and supportive, and had taken genuine interest in Jason's life and development, but that the secrecy had always created a sense that something was wrong or shameful about their relationship, that being hidden suggested Jason wasn't good enough to be acknowledged, or that Martin was embarrassed by the circumstances of his birth. My father said Jason seemed like a thoughtful and articulate young man who'd clearly been affected by Martin's choices, but who'd built a successful life despite the complications of growing up with a father who lived a double life. I tracked down the apartment on 16th Avenue NW where Martin and Jason had lived, a modest 2-bedroom unit in a complex built in the 1980s that now looked worn and dated compared to newer developments that had sprung up around Hickory in recent years. The current tenant was a single mother who'd lived there for 3 years and who knew nothing about previous residents, but the apartment manager had records going back to the 1990s and confirmed that Martin Crawford had rented that specific unit from 1994 through 2010, had always paid rent on time, and had been a quiet tenant who'd never caused problems or attracted complaints from neighbors. The manager said Martin had moved out suddenly in 2010, had given only 2 weeks' notice and had said something about relocating for work, and had left the apartment in good condition with no damage beyond normal wear that had been covered by his security deposit. I asked if the manager remembered anything else about Martin or about the boy who'd lived with him, and she said she remembered the child vaguely, a polite kid who'd played basketball in the parking lot and who'd seemed well cared for and happy, but that Martin had been private and hadn't socialized with other tenants or participated in community events that might have led to deeper acquaintance. I found neighbors who'd lived in the complex during the years Martin and Jason had been there, residents who'd watched Jason grow up and who'd known Martin as a single father raising his son alone with occasional help from the boy's mother who'd visit on weekends. One neighbor named Patricia Sims remembered Martin as devoted but stressed, someone who'd worked long hours at the furniture factory and had then come home to handle all the responsibilities of parenting without the support system that married couples or extended families typically provided. Patricia said she'd babysat Jason occasionally when Martin had needed to work overtime or had emergencies that required him to be away, and she'd noticed that Martin never talked about his own family or mentioned parents or siblings who might have been able to help with childcare or provide the kind of support that most single parents relied on. She'd asked Martin once if his family lived far away, or if there had been a falling out that kept them distant, and Martin had said something vague about complicated relationships and old conflicts that he preferred not to discuss, and Patricia had respected that privacy and hadn't pushed for details that Martin clearly didn't want to share. Patricia showed me photographs she'd taken at a birthday party she'd hosted for Jason when he'd turned 8, images that showed Martin looking tired but happy, engaged with the children, and clearly proud of his son even in the midst of what must have been exhausting daily logistics of working full-time and raising a child alone. She said Martin had occasionally mentioned traveling to Virginia to visit family, had explained his absences by saying he had obligations there that he couldn't neglect, and Patricia had assumed he was caring for aging parents or maintaining relationships with siblings who lived too far away to visit regularly. She'd never suspected that Martin was keeping Jason's secret from those family members, had never imagined that the visits to Virginia involved hiding an entire portion of his life and pretending to be someone without children or the responsibilities that came with parenthood. Patricia said, "Learning now that Martin had maintained that deception for 16 years made her sad, made her wish she'd pushed harder to understand why he seemed so isolated and why he'd never brought his Virginia family to Hickory to meet his son or participate in the life Martin was building there." The furniture factory where Martin had worked as a quality control inspector had closed in 2009, part of the wave of manufacturing collapse that had devastated Hickory's economy and had eliminated thousands of jobs when companies had moved production overseas or had gone bankrupt trying to compete with cheaper foreign imports. I found former co-workers through LinkedIn and Facebook, people who'd worked alongside Martin during his years at the factory, and several agreed to talk with me about their memories of him and about what they'd known of his personal life. A man named Robert Chen had been Martin's supervisor for 5 years and said Martin had been reliable and skilled, someone who'd taken pride in his work and who'd been respected by colleagues and management for his attention to detail and his commitment to maintaining quality standards even as the company had been cutting costs and reducing staff. Robert said Martin had been private about his personal life, had mentioned having a son, but had never brought the boy to company events or family days that the factory had organized before the economic pressures had eliminated those kinds of activities. Robert remembered that Martin had often worked double shifts to earn overtime pay, had seemed driven to maximize his income in ways that suggested financial pressure or obligations beyond what a single person would typically need. He'd asked Martin once if he was saving for something specific or if he had debts he was trying to pay down, and Martin had said he had responsibilities that required more money than his base salary provided, but he hadn't elaborated on what those responsibilities were. Robert said he'd assumed Martin was supporting elderly parents, or was paying off student loans, or had expensive hobbies that consumed his extra income. Had never imagined that Martin was also maintaining a separate identity and traveling regularly to Virginia to visit family who didn't know about his son or about the life he was living in Hickory. Robert said the factory closing in 2009 had been devastating for Martin, that he'd been one of the last employees laid off and had seemed genuinely distressed about losing the job and the income it had provided, and Robert had tried to help him find other work in the area, but had eventually lost touch when Martin had stopped responding to calls and messages. The timeline of Martin leaving Hickory in 2010 aligned with Jason turning 16 and with the end of the photographs in the albums I'd found, and I wondered if my uncle had left because Jason had become old enough to question the secrecy more forcefully, or because the financial pressure of raising a teenager had become unsustainable after losing his factory job. Rebecca said Martin had told her in 2010 that he needed to relocate for work opportunities, that he'd found a position in Charlotte that would pay better and would provide more stability than anything available in Hickory after the factory closings, but that he'd stay involved in Jason's life and would continue to contribute financially to his support. She said Martin had kept that promise, had sent money regularly, and had visited Jason monthly during his high school years, but that the relationship had become more strained as Jason had grown older and had started asking harder questions about why his father lived in Charlotte under one name and visited Hickory under another, and why his extended family had never been told about his existence. I found that Martin had worked in Charlotte from 2010 until 2018, employed by a quality assurance firm that contracted with manufacturing companies throughout the region, and during those years he'd apparently maintained his connection to Jason while also staying in contact with our family in Virginia and attending holidays and family gatherings where he'd continued to present himself as childless and unencumbered by the kinds of family obligations that would have made his frequent absences and his financial constraints noticeable or questionable. My father said Martin had seemed stressed during those years, had talked about work pressure and economic uncertainty, but had never mentioned having a son who was heading to college or needing financial support beyond what a single person would require. I wondered how Martin had managed the finances, how he'd paid for Jason's needs while also maintaining his own household in Charlotte and contributing to family expenses when he'd visit Virginia, and the bank records I found in the storage unit showed significant credit card debt and loans that suggested Martin had been stretching himself financially in ways that would have eventually become unsustainable. Jason agreed to meet with me and my father in Asheville, a neutral location that felt less loaded than either Hickory, where he'd grown up, or Virginia, where our family lived, and we sat in a restaurant overlooking the French Broad River and tried to bridge 30 years of separation and secrecy. Jason brought his own collection of photographs and mementos from his childhood with Martin, objects that had clearly been precious to him and that had helped him maintain connection to a father who'd been present but always slightly distant, always holding something back that Jason had sensed but couldn't name until he'd been old enough to understand that the secrecy meant he was being hidden rather than protected. My father looked at those photographs and saw his brother in different contexts than he'd ever witnessed. Martin as an engaged parent helping with homework and coaching Little League and attending school concerts, and he said it was disorienting to realize that his brother had been living this complete other life while also maintaining the facade of being a bachelor, focused primarily on his career and his own interests. Jason said he'd spent years being angry with Martin for the secrecy, for choosing to hide him rather than dealing with whatever family conflicts or judgments might have come from acknowledging an unplanned child, and that anger had been compounded by the fact that Martin had died without ever fully explaining his choices or apologizing for the harm the secrecy had caused. Jason said he'd wanted to attend Martin's funeral, had wanted to meet the family members Martin had talked about occasionally in vague terms, but Martin had made him promise years earlier not to reveal himself after Martin's death, had said that introducing himself as Martin's son would create chaos and pain for people who'd loved Martin and who deserved to remember him without having their understanding of his life completely upended. Jason had kept that promise until I'd contacted Rebecca, but keeping it had meant grieving alone without the support of extended family and without the acknowledgement that he'd lost someone important who'd shaped his life in profound ways, despite the complicated circumstances of their relationship. My father asked Jason about his childhood with Martin, what kind of father he'd been, and whether the secrecy had overshadowed the positive aspects of their relationship or had coexisted with genuine care and involvement. Jason said Martin had been a good dad in all the practical ways, had been present for important moments, and had provided stability and support, but that there had always been an emotional distance that Jason had attributed to Martin's personality, before eventually understanding it as the inevitable result of compartmentalization and the constant vigilance required to keep two lives separate. He said Martin had seemed most relaxed and present during their camping trips, times when they'd been away from both Hickory and Virginia, and hadn't had to worry about running into people who knew Martin in his other identity, and those trips had been the moments when Jason had felt closest to his father and had gotten glimpses of who Martin might have been if he hadn't been carrying the weight of his double life. Jason showed us letters Martin had written to him over the years, communications that revealed more vulnerability and reflection than Martin had apparently shown in person, and in those letters, Martin had expressed regret about the secrecy, while also defending it as necessary given circumstances he couldn't or wouldn't explain fully. In one letter from 2015, Martin had written that he'd made choices when Jason was born, that had seemed right at the time, but that had created problems he hadn't anticipated, that the longer he'd maintained the separation between his two lives, the harder it had become to imagine bridging them without destroying relationships that mattered to him on both sides. Martin had written that he loved Jason and was proud of the man he was becoming, but that he couldn't give Jason the extended family and the public acknowledgement he deserved, because doing so would require admitting to decades of deception and would force everyone who trusted him to reconsider everything they thought they knew about his character and his integrity. I asked Jason if he'd ever tried to contact our family on his own, if he'd considered reaching out to his grandfather or to my father or to other relatives to introduce himself and force Martin to deal with the consequences of his secrecy, and Jason said he'd thought about it constantly during his teenage years, but had decided that forcing the issue would only damage his relationship with Martin without necessarily leading to acceptance or connection with the extended family. He'd worried that our family would blame him for the deception, would see him as evidence of Martin's failures, rather than as a person deserving of relationship in his own right, and that fear had been strong enough to keep him from acting on his desire to know his family. Jason said Martin had reinforced those fears, had told him that our family was judgmental and traditional, and would have difficulty accepting a child born outside of marriage, and that introducing Jason would create conflict and division that would ultimately hurt everyone involved, including Jason himself. My father said he wished Martin had trusted him enough to share the truth, that they'd been close as brothers despite the geographic distance between them, and that he would have supported Martin and would have welcomed Jason into the family, regardless of the circumstances of his birth. He said our parents had been conservative in some ways, but had also been loving, and would have adapted to the reality of an unexpected grandchild, and that Martin's fears about their reaction had probably been exaggerated or had been projections of Martin's own shame and guilt rather than accurate predictions of how the family would have actually responded. Jason said hearing that was simultaneously comforting and painful. Comforting because it suggested he could have had relationships with extended family if Martin had been braver or more honest, and painful because it meant the secrecy had been unnecessary and had deprived him of connections that could have enriched his life and provided the sense of belonging that comes from being part of a larger family structure. We spent hours that afternoon sharing stories and photographs, constructing a more complete picture of Martin by combining what we'd each known about him in our separate contexts. And the person who emerged was someone who'd been capable of deep love and profound selfishness simultaneously, who'd cared genuinely about the people in his life, but who'd prioritized his own comfort and his own fear of judgment over the needs of the son he'd created and the family he'd kept that son hidden from. Jason said he'd made peace with his father's limitations, had accepted that Martin had done the best he could, even if that best had been inadequate in important ways, and that he wasn't looking for apologies or explanations that could never come now that Martin was dead. He said he was interested in knowing his extended family if we were interested in knowing him, in building relationships that weren't dependent on Martin's mediation or approval, and in being acknowledged as part of the family tree, even if that acknowledgement came decades later than it should have. My father invited Jason to Virginia to meet his grandfather, who was 92 and in declining health, and Jason made that trip 2 weeks later with Rebecca, who'd never met any of Martin's family, despite having been Jason's mother for 30 years. My grandfather was confused at first when we explained that Jason was Martin's son, had difficulty understanding how his son could have had a child he'd never mentioned, but eventually he'd accepted the information and had welcomed Jason with the kind of automatic affection that grandparents extend to grandchildren, regardless of the circumstances of their arrival in the family. My grandfather had said that Martin had always been private and hard to read, that he'd worried about his younger son, but had never been able to penetrate the emotional barriers Martin had constructed, and that learning about Jason explained some of the distance and the financial stress that Martin had exhibited over the years, but had never explained satisfactorily. My grandfather showed Jason photographs of Martin as a child and teenager, images that provided context for the man Jason had known, and that revealed similarities in personality and interests that hadn't been obvious when Jason had only known Martin as an adult. They talked about Martin's military service and his work in furniture manufacturing, about his hobbies and his sense of humor and the ways he'd approached problem-solving and relationships, and through those conversations, Jason built a richer understanding of his father's background and the forces that had shaped his character and his choices. My grandfather asked Jason about his own life, his work as a graphic designer and his interests and his plans for the future, and he said he was proud to know his grandson, even though the circumstances of their meeting were complicated by Martin's secrecy and by the years they'd lost when they could have been part of each other's lives. The storage unit in Hickory remains paid through the end of this year, the automatic bank withdrawals having continued for several months after Martin's death before the account was finally closed, and Jason has asked if he can keep some of the furniture and belongings as tangible connections to his father and to the home they'd shared during his childhood. I've told him he can take whatever he wants, that the material objects matter less than the relationships we're building now and the effort to integrate him into a family that should have known him from birth, but that's welcoming him now with the kind of acceptance that might help heal some of the wounds Martin's secrecy created. We've gone through the photograph albums together, Jason adding context to images I'd found mysterious, and explaining the stories behind pictures that had seemed like random snapshots, but that actually documented important moments in his development and in his relationship with Martin. I think about my uncle often now, about the double life he maintained for 16 years, and then the 8 additional years when he'd stayed connected to Jason while living in Charlotte and maintaining his relationships with our family in Virginia. And I try to understand what kind of fear or shame could have motivated that level of sustained deception. The explanations Martin gave in his letters to Jason don't feel adequate to the magnitude of what he did, hiding a son and depriving that son of extended family, and depriving his own parents of knowing their grandson, all to avoid confronting whatever judgment or conflict he imagined would come from acknowledging an unplanned pregnancy. I wonder if Martin had created a story in his mind about how our family would react, and had then lived his life as if that imagined reaction was reality, never testing whether his fears were justified, because testing them would have required vulnerability and honesty that felt more dangerous than simply maintaining the separation between his two worlds. The box that arrived from the estate sale company sits in my closet now, a container filled with evidence of a secret life and a hidden child, and I take it out occasionally when I need to remind myself that people are capable of sustaining elaborate deceptions, while also being capable of genuine love and commitment. The photographs of Martin with Jason show a man who was present and engaged, who clearly cared about his son and took pride in watching him grow and develop, and those images are difficult to reconcile with the man who chose to keep that son hidden from everyone else who mattered in his life. Jason has said that he's learned not to expect perfect consistency from people, that his father was both the man who coached his Little League team and the man who refused to introduce him to his grandparents, and that both versions were real even if they contradicted each other in ways that simple moral judgments can't adequately capture. My father has included Jason in the family will, has made sure he's recognized as Martin's son and as a legitimate heir to whatever estate Martin left behind, and has encouraged other family members to reach out and build relationships with the nephew they never knew existed. Some relatives have been welcoming and have integrated Jason into family gatherings and communications without apparent difficulty, while others have been more reserved and have struggled to understand why Martin kept such a significant secret for so long. Jason has handled those varied reactions with grace and maturity, has said he doesn't expect everyone to embrace him immediately, and that he's willing to give relationships time to develop organically rather than forcing connections that people aren't ready for. Rebecca has said that watching Jason connect with Martin's family has been bittersweet, has made her realize what Martin deprived both Jason and his extended family of by maintaining the secrecy for so many years, but has also made her grateful that the truth finally emerged, even if it took Martin's death to make that emergence possible. She's said she wishes she'd pushed Martin harder to be honest with his family, that she'd accepted his explanations too easily and had enabled his deception by going along with the use of the false name and the separation between his two lives. Rebecca has said she'd been young and uncertain and had been grateful to have Martin's support as a co-parent, and that gratitude had made her reluctant to challenge him about the secrecy or to insist on transparency that might have driven him away and left her raising Jason completely alone. The apartment on 16th Avenue NW where Jason grew up has been renovated and rented to new tenants who know nothing about the family that lived there from 1994 to 2010, and the physical space holds no remaining traces of the 16 years Martin and Jason spent there building a life together while keeping that life hidden from everyone who should have been part of it. The complex where they lived has aged and deteriorated, its units now housing primarily low-income residents and people in transition who stay for a few months before moving on to other temporary situations, and the sense of community that might have existed when Martin and Jason lived there has been replaced by the transience and anonymity that characterizes so many rental properties in economically struggling cities. I've driven past that apartment several times, parked across the street, and tried to imagine what daily life was like for my uncle and his secret son, what their routines were, and how they navigated the ordinary logistics of parent and child, while also maintaining the extraordinary deception that kept half of Jason's family from knowing he existed. The funeral we held for Martin in 2021 was attended by family members who'd known only the official version of his life, the bachelor uncle who'd worked in manufacturing and who'd been devoted to his career but who'd never settled down or started a family of his own. And none of them had suspected that the man they were mourning had actually raised a son and had maintained a secret second identity for decades. I think about what that funeral would have been like if Jason had been there, if he'd been able to stand with us and grieve openly as Martin's son, rather than having to mourn alone in Asheville while we buried his father without acknowledging his existence. Jason has said he understands why Martin asked him not to reveal himself at the funeral, that Martin was trying to protect him from the judgment and the questions that would have come from appearing as a surprise son that no one had known about. But that understanding doesn't make the exclusion hurt less or make up for the fact that he was denied the right to publicly mourn his father alongside the rest of the family. We've talked about having a second memorial service now that Jason has been integrated into the family, a gathering where we can acknowledge the complete truth of Martin's life, including the 16 years he spent raising a son in Hickory and the additional years he spent maintaining that relationship while living in Charlotte, and where Jason can be recognized as Martin's child and as a valued member of our extended family. Jason has said he appreciates the gesture, but isn't sure he needs a formal ceremony to feel acknowledged, that the relationships he's building with family members now and the acceptance he's receiving from most of the relatives he's met feel more meaningful than any official recognition could provide. He said what matters most is that his children, Martin's grandchildren, will grow up knowing their extended family and won't have to carry the burden of secrecy that shaped his own childhood and that deprived him of connections that should have been his birthright. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next investigation, where we uncover the secret children that people hide from their families for decades and discover the complicated reasons that drive parents to choose deception over honesty, even when that choice causes lasting harm to everyone involved.